She didn't scream. She didn't fight. When the most powerful Luna in the Nightgrave Empire knelt before her husband's mistress beneath a blood-red moon, 10,000 wolves went completely silent. Not because they agreed, because they finally saw it. The cruelty their king had dressed up as order, the rot he'd called tradition. Soralia Duskbane didn't kneel out of defeat. She knelt to show the Empire exactly what kind of man wore its crown. And when she looked up from that stone floor, her eyes weren't broken. They were recording. Stay until the end. You won't see this kind of quiet power anywhere else. Drop your city in the comments and hit that like so your pack finds this story. The blood moon came once in a generation. Old soldiers said it was the sky bleeding, that the heavens cracked open above the Nightgrave Empire every 30 years and poured out something ancient, something that didn't have a clean name in any language. The light it cast wasn't warm. It was the color of a wound that hadn't scabbed over yet, thick and dark, and almost purple at the edges. And it soaked into the limestone of Vexthorn capital like dye into cloth until every wall, every banner, every upturned face in the ceremony square looked stained with it. 40,000 people had pressed into the capital for the Blood Moon convocation. Wolves from the northern ridge territories with frost still caught in their furs. Southern delegates in silk that cost more than most wolves earned in a year. Merchant houses and minor lords and mid-territory pack soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder in the outer rings of the square, all of them craning their necks toward the central dais where the royal household would appear. They came because tradition demanded it. They came because skipping the Blood Moon convocation was the kind of thing that got your territory's trade license reviewed, your border access questioned, your sons passed over for royal guard appointments. But they also came. And this was the part nobody said out loud, because the Nightgrave Empire under Alpha King. Raylor. Vexthorn had become the kind of place where you watched the throne closely, not out of admiration, out of the same instinct that made you keep one eye on a predator even when it was supposedly calm. Luna Soralia Duskbane stood in the preparation chamber beneath the main dais and listened to the crowd noise filter through 2 feet of stone. She had been standing for 40 minutes. Not pacing, standing. Her hands loose at her sides, her spine straight, her breathing the kind of deliberate, measured thing you had to practice to get right when your chest wanted to do something else entirely. The chamber smelled like cold wax and iron polish, and underneath that, faint and persistent, the mineral bite of the underground spring that ran beneath the palace foundations. Her attendant, a younger woman named Bressa, who had served her for 11 years and kept her mouth shut about everything she witnessed, was working on the final clasps of Soralia's ceremonial robe. Her fingers were steady. Bressa's fingers were always steady. It was one of the things Soralia valued most about her. "It's pulling left at the shoulder seam again," Soralia said. "I know, I've been trying to correct it for 10 minutes. Bressa's voice was neutral, informational. "The lining was recut 3 days ago. I don't know who authorized the change." Soralia didn't answer that immediately. She already knew who had authorized it. Veressa Thornvale had standing authority over the royal wardrobe now, a quiet expansion of influence that had happened 6 months ago through a council amendment that nobody had bothered to mention to Soralia until the appointment was already sealed. The robe pulling at her shoulder wasn't an accident. It was a message written in thread. "You don't fit here anymore. Even your clothes know it." "Leave it," she said finally. Bressa paused. "My lady, it won't matter." Bressa's hand stilled on the clasp. Something moved through the air between them. Not pity, because Bressa was too careful for pity, but something adjacent to it. A recognition. She finished the clasp without another word and stepped back. Soralia turned to look at herself in the bronze mirror. The woman looking back at her was 31 years old and had the face of someone who had been beautiful in a way that war changes but doesn't erase. High cheekbones that threw shadows. Eyes that were dark gray in most light and went almost silver when she was angry, which meant they were dark gray nearly all the time now because she had learned 3 years ago to stop letting the anger show. Her hair was the deep brown black of pine bark after rain, dressed up tonight in the ceremonial pins of the Nightgrave Luna. Hammered silver wolves mid-stride, their bodies curved into crescent shapes. And it was the only part of her appearance that Veressa's people hadn't managed to alter. The robe was midnight blue trimmed in silver. It should have been perfect. The shoulder seam made it look like someone else's clothes on the wrong body. Soralia reached up and smoothed the fabric herself. It didn't fix the seam. It just looked like she'd chosen it. That was the whole game now, making everything look like a choice. Outside, the crowd noise swelled and then settled, the kind of collective adjustment that meant the royal herald had taken the dais. The ceremony was beginning. The door to the preparation chamber opened without a knock. Soralia didn't turn around right away. She already knew the footsteps, the particular rhythm of heels that were just slightly too confident, the rustle of fabric that cost twice what it should because the woman wearing it needed you to hear it coming. Lady Veressa Thornville stopped 3 feet inside the chamber like she owned the threshold. "You look tired," Veressa said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a blade dressed as an observation. Soralia turned from the mirror. Veressa. Veressa was 26 and knew exactly what 26 looked like in the right light. She had chosen every element of tonight with the kind of precision that took hours to make look effortless. Her gown a deep crimson that caught the blood moon color and threw it back brighter, her auburn hair loose across one shoulder in the style that Raylor had once publicly praised at a harvest banquet 2 years ago. She wore the moonstone pendant at her throat that Soralia had last seen locked in the royal treasury. She didn't walk further into the room. She stood in the doorway and looked at Soralia with the expression of someone measuring a room before buying it. "The king asked me to escort you to the dais waiting area," Veressa said. Bressa made a very small sound behind Soralia, barely audible, a controlled exhale. "The king has a herald for that," Soralia said. "He does. He sent me instead." Veressa smiled, not wide, just enough. He thought it would look more cohesive, the 3 of us entering the ceremony together. There it was, not a request, an arrangement that had already been decided, presented after the fact because that was how these things worked now. The window for objection had already closed before Soralia was informed of the window's existence. Soralia looked at Veressa for a long moment. She thought about what was underneath the smile, the years of careful maneuvering, the council allies, the slow erosion of every formal protection that the Luna's position was supposed to carry. She thought about the morning 2 years ago when she had sat in the royal healer's chamber and been told, gently and with professional regret, that the tests confirmed she was unable to carry a child, and the way Raylor's face had done something in the following days that she couldn't fully name, but that lived in her chest like a cold stone ever since. She thought about all of it, and she let none of it touch her face. "Then I suppose we shouldn't keep the ceremony waiting," Soralia said. She walked past Veressa and out the door. Tut-tut. The dais was built to make individuals feel like symbols. 30 feet above the ceremony square, wide enough to hold 40 standing members of the royal household with room between them, floored in black granite that had been quarried from the northern mountains 2 centuries ago and polished every year by a team of 6 specifically appointed for the task. The banners of the 9 empire territories hung from the overhead beams in their official order, and in the center of the dais, the Nightgrave throne, a brutal, unbeautiful thing made from iron and territorial war trophies, sat empty and waiting. Alpha King Raylor Vexthorn entered from the rear corridor at precisely the moment the herald announced him, because Raylor did not miss his entrances. He was 42 years old and built like the empire he ran, massive and deliberate and designed to project permanence. 6'4", broad through the chest and shoulders in the way that was less about vanity and more about the genetic weight of dominant alpha bloodlines stacked back 7 generations. His ceremonial armor was black iron inlaid with the silver Vexthorn wolf sigil, and he wore it the way men wear things they've long stopped thinking about, automatically, correctly, without gratitude. His hair was dark with threads of gray at the temples that had appeared in the last 3 years, and that he had never once commented on. He took the throne without looking at Soralia. That was not new. What was new, or rather, what was new in its particular formal public arrangement, was the placement of Veressa Thornvale. She had taken a position 3 feet to the right of the throne, not among the council rows, not in the lady-in-waiting section along the east railing, 3 feet from the throne, standing in a posture of association that the court would read and was clearly meant to read in one specific way. Soralia's designated position was the Luna's chair 8 feet to the left of the throne. She went to it. She sat. She placed her hands in her lap with her fingers spread and loose, and she looked out at 40,000 people bathed in blood-colored moonlight, and she breathed. Across the dais, she felt Raylor's gaze find her for exactly 2 seconds and then move away. She didn't return it. The herald began the formal convocation. Old language, Empire-sanctioned, the words worn smooth from repetition. The crowd below was quiet with the specific quality of quiet that large groups produce when they are collectively uncertain. Attentive, a little held in breath, waiting for the thing they sensed was coming without being able to name it. Councillor Drevath, first of the Royal Council, and the man who had spent the last 4 years incrementally transforming the Luna's ceremonial role from functional to decorative, rose from his seat to read the Blood Moon address. His voice carried well. It always did. He was 63 years old and had served 4 successive Nightgrave rulers and had the survival instincts of something that lived under rocks. In the time before counting, Drevath read, the Nightgrave lineage was sealed in blood and bond and in the promise of continuation. Tonight, as the Blood Moon witnesses, we reaffirm the strength of the Empire through the strength of its sovereign line. In the front ranks of the ceremony square, a veteran soldier named Kale, scarred through the jaw from a border skirmish 8 years ago, loyal to the Luna's household, in the particular quiet way that soldiers developed loyalty when they saw who actually remembered their names, watched the dais and felt something cold work its way through him. He had been at every Blood Moon convocation of his adult life. He knew the protocol. He could see what the arrangement on that dais meant, and he could see, from where he stood, that the Luna was sitting 8 feet from her husband, with her hands folded and her face like still water, and that the woman standing 3 feet from the throne was wearing the Luna's treasury pendant. Next to him, a merchant from the Eastern Territories leaned slightly and murmured, "Is that the mistress up there?" Kale didn't answer. The merchant said quieter, "Standing at the throne?" "Watch the ceremony," Kale said. His voice came out flatter than he intended. Midway through the second ceremonial address, the reading of territorial bondings, a 40-minute recitation that everyone endured, Veressa Thornvale did something small and significant. She stepped forward. Not much. 8 inches. Perhaps 10. But she moved from her static position to a point that placed her within the visual frame of the throne itself, and she turned slightly toward Raylor, and she said something to him in a voice too low for the ceremony square to hear, but clearly visible as speech. And Raylor, without looking at her directly, but without moving away, inclined his head. It lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Soralia watched without appearing to watch, her gaze forward, her face the temperature of deep winter. The merchant from the Eastern Territories had stopped pretending to listen to the bonding recitation. He wasn't the only one. The confrontation, if you could call it that, if the word confrontation still meant 2 parties in opposition when one of them had decided, for reasons the other did not yet understand, to absorb rather than deflect, came at the 3rd ceremony interval. The royal household withdrew briefly to the covered antechamber behind the dais while the ceremony square performed its territorial salute sequence. This was traditional. 12 minutes, enough for water, and the kind of short, sharp exchanges that couldn't happen in public. Raylor waited until the antechamber door closed before turning to look at Soralia. "You're wearing the shoulder incorrectly," he said. "The seam was recut without my approval," Soralia said. A pause, the kind that had texture. "Veressa oversees the wardrobe." "I know." Then the adjustment would have been appropriate. Soralia looked at him. He was standing 8 feet away, and there was something in the distance between them that felt like geography. Not just space, but territory, with a border that had been redrawn without a formal announcement. "It pulls at the shoulder," she said. "It makes me look like I don't fit the robe." Raylor's jaw shifted. "Soralia, I'm making an observation. You're making a point. I'm describing a seam," she said. Her voice was level. "If there's a point in that, you put it there." For a moment, and she had learned to watch for these moments, to catalog them because they told her where the walls still had gaps, something moved through his expression that wasn't irritation or dismissal. Something that looked, briefly, like the face of a man who was lost and knew it. Then it was gone. Veressa, across the antechamber, lifted a cup of water and said to no one in particular, "The crowd response has been exceptional tonight. The people love the ceremony." "The people love a spectacle," Soralia said. She was not speaking to Veressa. She did not look at Veressa. She set it to the middle distance, conversationally, and then she walked to the water table and poured herself a cup. Raylor watched her do it. Counselor Drevath cleared his throat. Your Majesty, the salute sequence ends in approximately 4 minutes. I know how long the salute sequence takes, Raylor said, and his voice had an edge in it that Drevath correctly identified as not directed at him. The final portion of the Blood Moon ceremony was the bonding affirmation. This was the part that the Empire required of its sovereign pair, a ritual public acknowledgement of the alpha bond between the king and his Luna, performed in front of the full assembly, reaffirming the genetic and political contract that legitimized the royal line. It was supposed to be a moment of unity. It was supposed to be the image the Empire carried back to its territories, the king and his mate, side by side, unbroken, the foundation on which 40 years of Empire expansion had been built. What it actually required, in practical terms, was that Soralia and Raylor stand together at the forward edge of the dais, while the herald read the affirmation text, and that both of them acknowledge the bond verbally, and that they be visibly together in a way that a crowd of 40,000 could confirm and go home satisfied by. Soralia had performed this ritual 12 times. She knew it down to the inflection of the acknowledgement phrasing. She walked to the forward edge of the dais. She took her position beside Raylor. She was close enough to feel the warmth coming off him. The dense particular heat of a dominant alpha in full ceremony presentation, the kind of physical presence that still did something to her nervous system that she refused to examine in any detail. She looked out at the crowd. 40,000 faces in blood-red moonlight. Below, in the soldiers' section, Kale had gone very still. The herald began the affirmation text. Before the Empire and beneath the blood moon, the sovereign bond is acknowledged. Alpha and Luna, stone and spine, the paired authority by which the Nightgrave name endures. And then something happened that was not in the ceremony text. It happened because Raylor turned his head, briefly, and Veressa was visible at the edge of the dais, and the way Raylor's gaze moved to her took approximately 1.5 seconds, which was long enough for the front ranks of the ceremony square to see it. It happened because Veressa, in those 1.5 seconds, looked back at him with an expression that a crowd of 40,000 could read without commentary. And it happened because Soralia saw all of this in her peripheral vision and made a decision. She didn't make it quickly. She didn't make it in the heat of the moment because she had no heat left in her, not the kind that produced impulsive action. She made it the way she had made every decision for the last 3 years, slowly, in the dark, alone, turning the problem over until she found the angle that would hurt the least and accomplish the most. She stepped away from Raylor's side. Not dramatically, not with words, not with any visible display of feeling. She simply stepped back, 2 steps, and then turned and walked toward the center of the dais. The herald faltered, lost his place in the text, recovered, uncertainly. Raylor turned to look at her. His face was doing something that the front rows of the ceremony square could see clearly. Soralia stopped in the center of the dais. She looked at Veressa Thornvale. Veressa looked back at her. The crowd below had gone quiet in the particular way that 40,000 people go quiet when they collectively sense that something is happening that is not on the ceremony program. Soralia held Veressa's gaze for 3 seconds. Then she descended to one knee. Not a bow. A kneel. Full and deliberate, the posture of acknowledgement that, in Nightgrave ceremony law, was reserved for demonstrations before sovereign authority. She knelt before Raylor's mistress. In the silence that followed, and it was the most complete silence Soralia had ever heard, 40,000 people breathed out all at once, and then did not breathe back in. She kept her eyes up, not down, not submissive in the direction of her spine, the way defeat looked. She knelt, and she looked at Veressa, with her eyes full open, and her face carrying an expression that nobody in that ceremony square would be able to describe precisely afterward, but that everyone would remember. It wasn't broken. It wasn't beaten. It was the face of someone making the most expensive point they had ever made. Raylor said her name. His voice was low, and it had something in it she hadn't heard in 3 years. She did not stand. Below on the ceremony square, Kale's hand had moved to the Nightgrave crest on his chest plate. He wasn't gripping it. He was just touching it, the way a man touches something before he decides whether to keep it. What happened in the following minutes was not a continuation of the ceremony. The herald had gone silent. Counselor Drevoth was standing with his ceremonial document held at a slight angle, as if gravity had changed and he hadn't updated his posture to match. 3 of the 5 Royal Council members were turned toward each other in rapid, low-voiced exchange, the kind that meant they were already calculating rather than reacting. Raylor crossed the dais in 4 steps. He stopped in front of Soralia. "Get up," he said quietly. She did not move. "Soralia." His voice was harder. "This is not... Get up, now." "When the Empire has seen what it came to see," she said, just as quietly. Her voice carried anyway, because the silence was absolute and 40,000 people were very practiced at straining toward sound. His jaw was working. She could see the muscles in it from below, the specific tension of a dominant alpha whose authority was being publicly, completely, silently dismantled in front of his full court. "You are making a scene," he said. "I am performing a ceremony," she said. "You wanted affirmation. I'm affirming the hierarchy." That is not what this..." He stopped. Started again. "You are my Luna." "Your Luna." She let the words sit. Not with sarcasm, with weight. "Then perhaps you could look at me when you say it." The silence below them had changed quality. It was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of comprehension, the quieter, more dangerous kind, the kind that pools when 40,000 people are all understanding the same thing at the same time. Veressa had moved to the side railing of the dais. Her face was controlled, but her hands, Soralia had learned to watch the hands, had gone tight around the railing. Raylor crouched down in front of Soralia. It put them at eye level. This was not a thing the Alpha King of the Nightgrave Empire did in public, and the people in the front rows of the ceremony square processed what they were seeing with the specific cognitive delay that reality required of them. His voice dropped to something that only she could hear. "Why are you doing this?" Not a question. The cadence of a question with all the question taken out of it, replaced by something raw. Soralia looked at him for a long time, close enough to see the lines that had come into his face in the last 3 years, close enough to see his pulse working in his throat. "Because the people needed to see it," she said, "and so did you." "See what?" "What you allowed." She held his gaze without anger, without heat, with nothing that he could call emotion and dismiss. "You didn't do it cruelly, Raylor. That's the part that's going to stay with you. You let it happen one small thing at a time, and each small thing was survivable. And you never had to look at it directly, because I was always still standing. And standing, and standing." She paused. "I'm tired of standing." His hands, she noticed this now with a precision that felt almost clinical, were gripping his armored knee in a way that left marks in the leather. "Soralia, I'll stand when I choose to." She looked past him at Veressa, then back. "Not because you ask." She rose. "Not in any hurry. The way you rise when you have decided the floor has nothing more to tell you. Below, from somewhere in the soldiers' section, not loudly, not as a performance, but audibly, there was a sound that might have been a man exhaling a very long breath, or might have been the beginning of something else. The ceremony broke. Not violently, not with any single dramatic rupture, but in the way that things break when the structure holding them has been compromised too far. Not all at once, but progressively, in segments, each section giving way as the weight redistributed. The herald announced an interval that wasn't scheduled. Councillor Drevath moved in the direction of the king with the purposeful stride of a man who needed to manage what had just happened before it finished happening. The territorial delegates in the front sections were doing the thing that territorial delegates did, calculating proximity to the center, calculating what position statements would be required by tomorrow morning, calculating how their home packs would receive the information that the Blood Moon affirmation had been interrupted by the Luna kneeling before the royal mistress and the king crouching in front of his wife in front of 40,000 witnesses. Soralia walked back to the Luna's chair. She sat. She placed her hands in her lap. From the eastern railing, a Middle Territory soldier had removed his helmet, not thrown it, just taken it off and was holding it in both hands, looking at the dais. In the ceremony square, the mood was the specific mood of a crowd that has seen something it cannot unsee and is now deciding what to do with it. Not yet action, still in the precursor state, the held tension moment before a body of water decides to find a lower level. Kyle, in the front rank, had both hands at his sides now. His right hand was not touching the crest anymore. He was watching the Luna, and his face held the expression of a man who has spent years waiting for something to finally be legible. Bressa appeared at Soralia's left side. She had come from somewhere. The upper antechamber, the side passage, the places attendants occupied when the primary space was for principals. She stood one step behind the chair, hands loose, eyes forward. Soralia said, barely above a murmur, "Did you get the message to Warden Thoss?" 2 hours ago, Bressa said. The same informational tone as always, steady. He confirmed receipt. And the border commanders. Captain Vrail confirmed by seal this afternoon. Commander Sethis was harder to reach. He confirmed before the ceremony. Soralia breathed, measured, in and out. Good, she said. Across the dais, Raylor was standing with Drevath and 3 council members in a tight grouping, and she could read the body language of the conversation without hearing a word of it. Drevath was talking fast, hands controlled but active. Raylor was listening with the stillness that meant he was working very hard to stay still. One of the council members, Lord Pethrick, whose territory shared a border with 2 of Soralia's strongest supporter regions, had turned slightly away from the group, his gaze moving over the ceremony square below with an expression that was not reassurance. Veressa had retreated from the railing. She was standing near the back of the dais now, and she was still controlled, but her eyes had found Soralia twice in the last 3 minutes, and the look in them was one Soralia recognized. Calculation that had started running behind. The herald, under instruction from somewhere, probably Drevath, who had the institutional instinct of a man who had outlasted 4 rulers, returned to the dais edge and announced that the ceremony would continue in 10 minutes. He said it in a tone that was professionally normal and fooled nobody. Below, nobody dispersed. 40,000 people stood in blood-red moonlight and did not move toward the exits. Raylor found her at the railing. He didn't announce himself. He crossed the dais and stood beside her, 2 feet of space between them, and looked out at the crowd that was looking back up at the dais with the specific attention of people who have decided they are not leaving. For almost a minute, neither of them spoke. "You planned that," he said finally. "I knelt," she said, "in a kneeling ceremony, in front of the woman who's been standing beside your throne for 8 months. I made it look exactly like what it was." His breathing changed. She heard it, the controlled exhale of a man reining something in. You have always been my Luna. That position has never... The position. She turned to look at him directly. "Say that word again and tell me you hear how it sounds." He looked back at her. The blood moon light was doing something to his face that made him look for a moment younger than 42 and considerably less like an Alpha King. It made him look like the man she had met at 22, when the political alliance that had become their bond was still in its negotiation phase, and she had not yet understood that he contained this other self, the one that chose empire over everything, that weighed every relationship in the currency of political utility, that could look at something breaking and continue looking until the break was complete because stopping it would have cost him too much. "There are things in motion that you don't understand," he said. His voice was lower now, less performance. "There are things in motion that you don't understand," she said back, and she said it without threat, without inflection, as a simple statement. He stared at her. Below, in the ceremony square, from the soldier sections on the northern side, there was a sound, low. More than one voice, not organized, not rehearsed, the specific sound of soldiers who have just decided to stop performing a feeling they no longer have. Raylor heard it too. She watched his head turn. In the torchlight of the northern section, 3 soldiers, not in formation, not with any signal, just 3 men who had clearly arrived at the same decision through separate routes, had removed the Nightgrave crests from their armor. They weren't destroying them. They weren't raising them in protest. They just held them in their hands. The men around them hadn't moved, hadn't signaled support, but hadn't moved away either. Raylor's jaw locked. "This is what you wanted," he said, and now there was something in it that she recognized as the beginning of anger that was really the beginning of fear. To destabilize. "I wanted," she said, and stopped. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she had wanted 8 years ago, when she had come to the Nightgrave Empire as the daughter of a border territory alliance and found him. Not the king, just the man, tired and brilliant and more careful with everyone else than with her, which she had taken as intimacy and which she now understood was also a kind of test she hadn't been told she was taking. She thought about Wanning. She thought about what happened to Wanning over 3 years of a cold stone palace, and a husband who was always in the same room but never quite present, and a council that had slowly, patiently, brick by brick, walled her out of every chamber that mattered. "I wanted you to stop allowing it," she said. "That's all. 3 years ago, or 2, or 6 months ago, or tonight, any point, just stop allowing it." His mouth opened, and from below, fuller now, from multiple sections, the sound had grown. Still not loud, still not organized, but pervasive, the way water was pervasive, finding every level simultaneously. Raylor looked down at the ceremony square, and his face did something that Soralia had never seen it do before. She had seen him manage a border war from a map table. She had seen him receive the news of his father's death without blinking. She had seen him preside over drought negotiations and alliance collapses, and the night their bonding ceremony caught fire in the East Wing and 3 guests died. She had never seen him look, even for a moment, like he did not know where he stood. "What did you do?" he said quietly. The sound from below had grown to the point where it was unmistakably voices. Not a chant, not a shout, not yet anything that could be reported as riot or protest, but the continuous low murmur of 40,000 people all speaking to the people immediately around them, all saying variants of the same thing, all arriving at the same reading of what they had watched happen on this dais tonight. Councillor Drevath was moving with urgency now. 3 guards had appeared at the dais access stairs. Veressa had gone completely still near the back railing with the expression of someone watching a mathematical calculation that they had been certain about arrive at a different answer. Soralia held Raylor's gaze. "I didn't do anything," she said. "I knelt. And then I stood." She looked out at the crowd. 40,000 wolves in blood-red moonlight, some of them looking up, some of them looking at each other, some of them looking at the soldiers in the northern section who were still holding their crests in their hands. Raylor said her name again. It came out differently than it had all night. And Soralia, looking out at the empire that had watched her husband's mistress wear her treasury pendant and stand at her husband's throne and be given her wardrobe and her formal duties and her ceremonial authority. One small adjustment at a time, felt something move in her chest that was not triumph and was not grief. It was the specific feeling of a decision that has already been made and is now simply being lived out. She turned from the railing. Behind her, Raylor stood in the blood-colored light, the sounds of his empire rising beneath him, and looked at the place where she had been standing the way a man looks at a wound he inflicted himself and has only just realized is fatal. In the ceremony square, from the soldiers, the merchants, the territorial delegates, from 40,000 people who had come to witness the strength of the sovereign line and had witnessed instead the thing underneath it, the murmur was building into something that didn't have a ceremony word for it. Not a rebellion. Not yet. Something quieter and therefore more dangerous. A people deciding, together, in real time, what kind of empire they were willing to stand inside of. And at the edge of the dais, half hidden in the antechamber doorway where she had been listening for the last 10 minutes, Warden Thoss, third in command of the Imperial military and the man to whom, 2 hours ago, Bressa had delivered a sealed message, looked at Soralia with the expression of a man who has received his orders and is waiting only for the right moment. The moment, Soralia knew, was already here. What she did not know, what she could not have known, because the information had been in a sealed vault in the palace archives for 7 years under a council-classified lock that only Drevath held the key to, was what Veressa had done the night before. What she had burned. What document, in what vault, had gone to ash in the early hours before the blood moon ceremony, and whether the ash was enough. Whether what remained was enough to destroy her, or enough to save her. The blood moon light fell across the broken ceremony. The empire held its breath. And in the palace archives, behind a door that had been standing undisturbed for 7 years, a lock turned that no one had authorized. The lock turned at the 3rd hour past midnight. Not the archive vault. That door was still closed, still holding whatever Veressa had decided needed burning. The lock that turned was the one on the Luna's private council chamber, a room that officially no longer existed on the palace floor plans because Councillor Drevath had authorized its administrative reassignment 14 months ago, and nobody had told Soralia because nobody had been required to. She turned the key herself. The mechanism was stiff from disuse. She put her weight behind it, and it gave, and the door opened into a room that smelled like cold stone and the particular staleness of air that had been sealed away from living people for over a year. Bressa carried the lamp. Warden Thos carried himself the way soldiers carried themselves when they had decided something. Close to the walls, weight forward, eyes on exits before furniture. There were 3 others. Captain Vriel, who commanded the western garrison and had served under Soralia's father before the territorial alliance brought him into Nightgrave service. Commander Sethis, border forces, 48 years old, a man who communicated primarily in silences and had communicated a great deal to Soralia over the last 18 months. And a woman named Lena, who held no military title and whose official role in the palace was archival transcription, and who was, in practical terms, the most dangerous person in the room. They didn't sit. The chairs were covered in dust sheets. Nobody moved to uncover them. Soralia set her lamp on the windowsill and turned to face the room. "The ceremony square is still holding," Vrael said. He wasn't asking. "Parts of it. The main crowd dispersed around midnight. The soldier sections haven't fully cleared." She looked at Thos. "The northern crests, 17 in the end," Thos said, "removed in the square. Not thrown, not destroyed, held." He paused in the way Thos paused, like the pause itself was load-bearing. "That matters. They kept them." "How does 17 crests matter against a full Imperial Guard?" Sethis said. He wasn't challenging. He was the kind of man who asked the hard version of the question so nobody had to pretend it didn't exist. 17 tonight, Soralia said. "In public. In the ceremony square during the Blood Moon convocation with 40,000 witnesses." She looked at him. "You were at Brenneth Ford. You know how these things start." Sethis was quiet for a moment, then, "I know how they end." "So do I." Lena had moved to the covered shelving along the east wall and was working by feel in the low light, her fingers moving over the covered surfaces with the accuracy of someone who had memorized dimensions rather than appearances. She stopped at a specific point. "The secondary archive transfer," she said. "Before Drevath sealed this room, I moved 3 document sets. He doesn't know." She looked at Soralia. "He thinks he sealed the room before I finished." "He was wrong," Soralia said. "He was wrong," Lena confirmed. Vriel exhaled. Not relief, calculation. "What's in the sets?" "Council session records from the period of the Luna's medical assessments. Specifically, the pharmaceutical procurement orders that ran concurrent with the healer's findings." Lena's voice was the same even tone as always, the kind that transcriptionists developed. The voice of a person who had spent years being the one who recorded things, rather than the one who said them, and had learned that the recorder's power was in what they chose to keep. And the correspondence file between Lady Thornvale and the healer's former assistant, former because the assistant left palace service 17 months ago and was given a resettlement stipend that was categorized in the accounts as she paused, a transitional welfare payment. The room was very still. Soralia looked at the shelf where Lena's hand rested. She looked at it for a long time. Something moved through her chest. Not surprise, because she had suspected, because the logic of it had assembled itself in her head 2 years ago, and she had spent 2 years refusing to confirm it, because confirmed knowledge was a different weight than suspected knowledge, and she had not been ready for the weight. She was ready now. "Show me," she said. Raylor found her at dawn. She was in the eastern corridor outside the archive vault when he came around the corner with 2 guards at a distance behind him, close enough to be present, far enough that he'd clearly told them to stay back. He was still in parts of his ceremony armor. He had taken off the chest plate, but the bracers were still on, and his hair was disordered in the way of a man who had been awake all night running his hands through it. He stopped when he saw her. She was holding a document. Not reading it. She had already read it. She was holding it the way you hold something that has permanently changed the dimensions of the room you're standing in. "Soralia." His voice was rough with sleeplessness. "I've been looking for you since—" "I know," she said. He looked at what was in her hands, then at her face. Something in his expression tried to read what it was seeing and couldn't quite complete the translation. "What is that?" "A pharmaceutical procurement order," she said. "Dated 4 years ago, co-signed by Varessa Thornvale and a palace healer's assistant who no longer works here." She looked up from the document. Her eyes were the flat dark gray of winter sky before snow. cross-referenced with a correspondence file that establishes the instruction chain. He was completely still. For the compound that was administered to me over a period of 2.5 years, she said, through the evening tea preparation, specifically targeted to suppress the reproductive cycle. She watched him. She watched him understand it. Not quickly. It moved through him in stages, the way structural damage moved through a building, level by level, each floor giving way to the one below until the foundation took the full weight of it. That's not, he started. The healer told you I was barren, she said. Her voice was even, informational, the voice of a woman who had been practicing this conversation in her head for 2 years. He told the council. He told you, and then he filed the formal assessment, and then the council used it. Soralia, were you part of it? Not an accusation. A question, stated flat, with all the room in it that a question like that needed. No. His voice came out hard and immediate. No. Were you aware? I was aware that you, the healer said. He stopped. His jaw worked. I believed what I was told. I know, she said, and she did know. That was the particular ugliness of it, that she had read him well enough for 8 years to understand that this specific cruelty had not been his, that he was capable of other cruelties, smaller ones, ones of omission and political convenience and choosing not to see, but not this, which meant she had been poisoned for 2.5 years while her husband believed the poison's results were her failure, which meant everything that had happened between them in the aftermath, every cold silence, every increasing distance, every moment he had looked at Veressa and then not looked at Soralia, was built on a foundation that Veressa had constructed and Rylor had never questioned because questioning it would have complicated what he wanted to be true. She set the document against her side. What do you want to do? He said. I want to bring it before the full court, she said. During the convocation continuation this morning. His expression shifted. Soralia. In front of the territorial delegates, in front of the council, in front of every witness who was in that square last night. She looked at him. You asked what I wanted. That's what I want. That will... He stopped himself, started again. The political exposure alone will... I know what it will do. He looked at her. He was doing the calculation. She could see him doing it. The Alpha King version of assessment, threats and assets and structural outcomes. She had watched him run it 100 times across 100 different situations. He was running it now on the information that his mistress had spent 2 years poisoning his Luna, and that he had not only failed to stop it, but had, in his failure to question, effectively enabled it. The calculation was not resolving cleanly. Give me the document, he said finally. No. His eyes came up. Lena has the full file, Soralia said. The document set. The correspondence. The payment record. She has been the custodian of it for 14 months, and she will continue to be. She held his gaze. It doesn't leave the people who know about it, not until this morning. The words sat between them. He looked at her with an expression she didn't have a name for. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't guilt, and it wasn't the careful political face he wore for the court. It was something that would have wrecked her 3 years ago, if she'd seen it 3 years ago, when there was still something in her that needed it. I should have, he started. Yes, she said. Simple, not cruel, just true. He closed his mouth. Go get some sleep, she said. You look like you haven't had any. She turned and walked back the way she'd come. Behind her, Rylor stood in the corridor alone and did not move for a long time. Essen. Veressa's chamber was on the 3rd floor of the West Wing. She had moved into it 22 months ago when her role as the king's companion had been formalized, a formalization achieved through a council measure authored by Lord Petherick and seconded by Drevath, framed as a matter of palace administrative clarity. The chamber was 3 times the size of what a lady-in-waiting occupied. It had its own receiving room. Its lock was the heavy cast kind. Soralia knocked at the 6th hour. She heard movement inside. A pause. Then Veressa's voice, controlled even in the surprise of early morning. Who is it? You know who it is, Soralia said. A longer pause. The sound of something being moved. Not furniture, something smaller, the particular sound of papers being handled quickly. Then the lock disengaged and the door opened. Veressa was dressed. That was the first thing. She was fully dressed, hair done, the armor of her appearance already in place, which meant she had either not slept or had woken early and prepared because she had spent the night waiting for exactly this knock. She stood in the doorway with one hand on the door and her face in the composed arrangement that Soralia had watched her maintain across 2 years of court life. She looked at Soralia, then at Soralia's hands, at the absence of the document. "It's early," Veressa said. "It is," Soralia agreed. Neither of them moved for a moment. "You should come in," Veressa said, and it came out sounding less like an invitation than a decision. She stepped back from the door. Soralia walked in. The receiving room was meticulous, everything placed, nothing incidental. A fire already built and burning, which confirmed the early waking. On the writing desk, a document box that was closed and latched with a lock Soralia didn't recognize. She looked at the box, then at Veressa. "The archive vault," Soralia said. "Last night." Veressa's expression didn't move. "I don't know what you mean." "Someone burned documents in the archive vault last night, before the ceremony. The duty archivist logged an after-hours access that was authorized under a council standing order." Soralia looked at her. "Your name isn't on the access log, but a council standing order authorization would only be triggered by someone with the right credential." "The council has 12 members," Veressa said. "Any of them could have—" "The vault access was logged at the 3rd hour of morning, 2 days before the ceremony," Soralia said. "Councillor Drevath was in the Northern Territories for a border hearing. Lord Petherick was traveling with the Eastern delegation. The other 10 council members were either accounted for or don't have a reason." She paused. "You do." Veressa was very still. The composed face was still composed, but her breathing had changed, barely, the way it changed when a person was maintaining control rather than simply having it. "This is an accusation," Veressa said. "It's a question." Soralia looked at the document box on the desk. "What was in the vault, Veressa?" Silence. "I went to a lot of trouble," Soralia said quietly, "to keep Lena in that archive room for 2.5 years. She's very good at her job. She's particularly good at identifying documents that are flagged for removal and making precise copies before they disappear." She let that sit. "Whatever you burned, she copied." The silence that followed was a different quality than the silence before it. It was the silence of a calculation failing. Soralia could see it happen, could see the sequence of recalculation run behind Veressa's eyes, the rapid reorganization of a position that had just lost one of its walls. Veressa said, "What do you want?" And there it was. Not denial anymore. The question underneath all of it, stripped of everything that had been wrapped around it for 2 years. Soralia looked at her. At the woman who had spent 2 years administering a compound through an evening tea preparation. At the woman who had watched Raylor receive the false assessment, had watched the marriage fracture, had moved into the space the fracture created with the patience and precision of someone who had been planning the geometry of it long before the opportunity appeared. Soralia thought about what she wanted. She thought, "I wanted my life back. I wanted the years back. I wanted the mornings when I still believed the cold stone of this palace was something that could warm." She said, "I want the court to have the truth." Veressa's jaw tightened. "If you go before the court, I'm going before the court. You'll destabilize everything. The territorial delegates know what they saw last night. They're already calculating." Soralia looked at her directly. "You planned for a lot of things, Veressa. You planned for my compliance. You planned for Raylor's complicity. You planned for Drevath's legal architecture." She paused. "You did not plan for patience." Veressa said nothing. "You kept waiting for me to fight," Soralia said, "to rage, to give you something visible to point at." She looked at the document box on the desk. "I didn't fight. I stayed. I endured every adjustment and every reassignment and every ceremony where you wore my pendant and stood at my husband's throne, and I stayed quiet and I watched, and I waited for the moment when staying quiet became louder than anything else I could have done." Her voice stayed even. "Last night was that moment." Veressa looked at her with an expression that was stripped of everything except the base material underneath. Not malice. That was the thing Soralia had understood eventually, which was more disturbing than malice would have been. It was the expression of a person who had simply decided that they wanted something and had pursued it with the same methodical efficiency that they would have applied to anything else. "You'll never be able to prove the compound was mine," Veressa said. The correspondence file has your signature, Soralia said, and the payment record names the healer's assistant specifically. He was given enough to relocate comfortably, but not enough to stay silent forever, and Lenny found him 3 months ago. She watched Veressa's face. He's already spoken. I just needed the archive documents to corroborate. The fire in the receiving room made a sound, a log settling. Veressa said very quietly, "What happens now?" "Now," Soralia said, "you get dressed for court." She turned and walked to the door. Behind her, Veressa was standing in the center of her receiving room with the firelight on her face and the document box on the desk beside her, and for the first time in the 2 years Soralia had known her, she looked like a person who had run out of moves. Soralia opened the door. "Wear something appropriate," she said, without turning back. "It's going to be a long morning." She walked out into the corridor and pulled the door shut behind her and stood for a moment in the quiet of the early palace with her hand still on the door handle and her eyes closed. In 4 hours, the convocation would reconvene. The territorial delegates would be in their seats, the council would be present, Raylor would be on the throne, and Lena would walk into the hall with a document set that had been sitting in a sealed room for 14 months. And Soralia would stand before the full court of the Nightgrave Empire and watch the Empire understand what had been done to its Luna. She did not know what Raylor would do with that understanding. That was the only part she had not been able to plan for. Everything else had a shape, a sequence, an anticipated response. But Raylor, the thing he would do in the moment when the full weight of it landed, when the years of complicity by omission and political preference arranged themselves into their true structure in front of 48 territorial witnesses, that remained, even now, beyond the reach of her calculation. She opened her eyes. Down the corridor, just rounding the corner from the main hall, Councillor Drevath had stopped walking. He was looking at her outside Veressa's door. He was carrying a leather document folio, and his expression was the very particular expression of a man who has arrived somewhere and found it already altered. They looked at each other from 30 feet away. Soralia said nothing. Drevath's eyes moved to Veressa's closed door. Back to Soralia. He looked at her the way he had looked at the last 3 kings, assessing survival geometry, calculating which direction had the most future in it. He turned and walked back the way he had come. Soralia watched him go. She thought, there it is. The thing that shifted. Not the soldiers removing crests, not the ceremony square, not Raylor's face in the blood-red light. The moment that couldn't be taken back was this one, Drevath recalculating, Drevath choosing a different corridor. The man who had architectured 4 years of quiet diminishment, looking at what the diminished woman had become and deciding he needed to be somewhere else when the morning happened. When the most politically durable man in the Nightgrave court decided your opponent was no longer worth his protection, the war had already changed. She walked toward the council hall. Behind her, somewhere in the west wing, a door she hadn't heard open clicked shut. Veressa was moving. The document set was already on the council table when Soralia entered the hall. Lena stood at the far wall with her hands folded and her eyes on the door. In the front row of the delegate seating, Lord Pethric of the Eastern Territories sat with his hands on his knees, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had come to witness one thing and had understood, before the session even began, that he was going to witness something else entirely. At the head of the table, the Alpha King's chair was empty. Soralia sat down in the Luna's seat. She waited. And when the door at the far end of the hall opened and Raylor entered, and stopped, seeing the document set laid out on the table, seeing Lenny at the wall, seeing Pethric's expression and Soralia's stillness, and the 48 territorial witnesses already in their seats, the door behind him swung open again. Veressa Thornville walked in 3 steps behind him. She was not running. She had not gone to the exits. She had done the calculation that only a particular kind of person does when all the walls have come down, the one that says if the truth is coming out anyway, the only remaining variable is where you're standing when it lands. She walked to her seat, and the hall, full of witnesses, went absolutely silent. Soralia set both hands flat on the table. "Let's begin," she said. Lena opened the document set at the 7th hour. She did it without ceremony. No announcement, no framing, no performance of significance. She simply untied the binding cord, laid the first document flat on the council table, and stepped back. The way you set down a weapon you've been carrying a long time. Carefully, with full understanding of what it was. The hall held 48 territorial witnesses, 12 council seats of which 9 were occupied, and the specific quality of silence that large rooms produced when everyone in them had stopped pretending to be comfortable. Raylor was in his chair at the head of the table. He had not spoken since entering. He had looked at the document set when he sat down, and then looked at Soralia, and then looked at neither, his gaze fixed at a point somewhere above the far wall that didn't correspond to anything physical. Soralia did not watch him. She watched the witnesses. Lord Petherick of the Eastern Territories leaned forward when Lenny placed the first document. His eyes moved across it quickly. A reader's eyes, efficient. And then he sat back. And what his face did in the following 3 seconds told Soralia more than anything he might have said. Councillor Marin, the only woman on the Royal Council and the member who had spent 14 months voting with Dravath on every Luna-adjacent measure while maintaining a personal manner toward Soralia of scrupulous professional courtesy, picked up the document closest to her and read it in full. Her face was unreadable until it wasn't. A muscle below her left eye moved once. Veressa sat 6 seats down the table from Soralia. She had taken the seat without invitation or direction, the seat she had been using for 8 months during council sessions in her capacity as the king's companion. A capacity that had no formal precedent in Nightgrave law, but that Dravath had enabled through a series of procedural adjustments that each, individually, could be defended. She sat with her hands in her lap, and her posture exact, and she did not look at the documents. She looked at Soralia. Soralia looked back at her. Lena read the first document aloud. Her voice was the transcriptionist's voice, neutral, precise, each word given equal weight so that the meaning had to carry itself without assistance from tone. She read the pharmaceutical procurement order in full. She read the dates. She read the compound description, which was clinical and specific, and which the healer members among the territorial delegations would understand immediately, and which everyone else would understand within 30 seconds of watching those healer members' faces. She read Veressa's co-signature. The hall didn't erupt. That was the thing. Soralia had half expected eruption, had planned for it, had thought through how to manage it. What she had not fully anticipated was the specific texture of what actually happened, which was a collective comprehension that moved through the room like temperature change, like the moment before a storm when the air pressure shifts and every living thing in the vicinity feels it in their joints before they can name what they're feeling. Delegate Orvash from the Northern Ridge Territories said, quietly, to nobody, "Stars above." Councillor Marin set down the document she was holding. She set it down very flat and very deliberately on the table in front of her and placed both palms over it. Raylor's hands, at the head of the table, closed into fists on the armrests. Lena continued reading. The session broke apart at the 9th hour. Not officially. Not with any formal adjournment. There had been no formal opening, which meant there was no procedural mechanism for closing, which was something Soralia had considered and chosen deliberately. What happened instead was that the weight of the material produced a natural fracturing, the way a bone broke under sufficient force along its existing fault lines, rather than anywhere new. The territorial delegates separated into their regional clusters. The council members dispersed, some to each other, some to the exits. 3 of the northern delegates requested immediate access to their communication birds. Lord Petherick walked to the window and stood there for a long time looking at the palace courtyard below, with the expression of a man revising a calculation he had thought was finished. Through all of it, Veressa did not move from her seat. Soralia stayed at her end of the table. She watched Raylor push back from his chair and stand and was aware, with the peripheral accuracy she had developed over 8 years of reading him, that he was moving toward her. Not toward Veressa. Toward her. He stopped at the corner of the table nearest her seat. He was close enough that she could hear his breathing, which was the controlled breath of a man keeping himself from doing something he'd regret in front of 48 witnesses. "I need to speak with you," he said. Low, for her only. "You're speaking with me now," she said. Privately. She looked up at him. His face was doing the thing she had seen in the corridor at dawn, that stripped-down expression without the political architecture over it, but enlarged now, deepened, the exposure that came when the architecture was removed by force rather than by choice. "After," she said. "Soralia, after." She held his gaze. "There's still the matter of the second document set." He went still. "What second set?" She looked at Lena, who was at the far wall gathering the first session's materials with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything. "Lena," Soralia said. Lena looked up. "Ready when you are, my lady." Raylor's eyes moved between them. Something moved through his face that she recognized, after a moment, as the particular expression of a man who had believed he understood the scope of a problem and has just understood that he didn't. "What's in the second set?" he said. "Council session records," Soralia said. "From the period of the original Luna's council seat reduction. Specifically the authorization chain for the wardrobe authority transfer, the archive room reassignment, and the ceremonial role amendments." She looked at him. Each one individually defensible. All together, a pattern. The muscle in his jaw moved. "And," she said, "the correspondence between Councillor Drevath and Lord Petherick from 14 months ago discussing the political utility of an heir-absent Luna in the context of upcoming territorial renegotiations." The silence that followed was a different category of silence than anything the session had produced so far. At the window, Lord Petherick had turned from the courtyard view. He was looking at Soralia's back with an expression that was no longer the expression of a man revising a calculation. "Where?" Raylor said, and his voice had dropped to something that was barely audible. "Did you get that correspondence?" "Lena is very good at her job," Soralia said. He looked at Lena. Lenny looked back at him with the polite, impenetrable expression of a woman who had spent 2.5 years being professionally invisible and had no intention of stopping now. Raylor looked back at Soralia. "You've been building this for 2 years, he said. 14 months, she said, since the archive room was reassigned. Before that I was still—" She stopped. She had been about to say hoping. "Before that I was managing one situation at a time." He searched her face. She let him look. There was nothing in it she needed to hide. "Why didn't you come to me?" he said, and the rawness in it was real. She heard it, felt it, recognized it as the thing underneath the king, the thing she had loved before the king covered it over so thoroughly she'd stopped being able to find it. "When?" she said. "Specifically, tell me when I should have come to you and what you would have done." He had no answer. She had known he wouldn't. That was not cruelty. It was just the shape of the truth, and she had stopped trying to make the truth a more comfortable shape a long time ago. The second document set took 40 minutes to present. By the time Lena finished the Drevath-Petherick correspondence, Lord Petherick had moved from the window to a seat in the far corner of the hall and was speaking in rapid, low tones to his territorial advisor. His face had the compressed quality of a man doing emergency mathematics, the kind that involved borders and trade routes, and how a political position taken 14 months ago would look in a court record that was about to become public. Councillor Marin had not moved from her seat. She had been sitting in the same position for 40 minutes with her hands flat on the table and her eyes tracking Lena's reading with the focus of someone who was making a decision rather than receiving information. Veressa was still in her seat, still not moving. She hadn't moved in 2 hours, hadn't spoken, hadn't requested anything, hadn't attempted the chamber exit that had been available to her for the entire session. Soralia had noticed this and had spent portions of the last 40 minutes trying to understand it, because Veressa's stillness was not the stillness of defeat. It was the stillness of someone waiting. The thought arrived at the back of Soralia's mind without announcement, and she recognized it immediately as important, and then, in the same breath, understood why she hadn't arrived at it sooner. Because she had been so focused on what she was presenting that she had not been watching what Veressa was not doing, and what Veressa was not doing was reacting to anything that should have broken her composure if the documents were the whole of it. Soralia looked at Veressa. Veressa looked back at her. And in Veressa's expression, composed, patient, exactly as controlled as it had been 2 hours ago, Soralia saw something she had missed. She had not run because she had nothing to run from yet. The pharmaceutical order, the correspondence, the healer's assistant's testimony. All of it pointed at Veressa. All of it established a pattern. All of it would be devastating in a public record. But Soralia looked at Veressa's face and understood with a cold drop of clarity that she was missing something, that there was a document not in either of Lena's sets, a variable she had not accounted for, something that Veressa had kept back, not burned, because burning would have been visible, but placed somewhere that Lena's archive access could not reach. The question was what? The question was whether she would find out before Veressa chose to use it. Lena finished the second set. She tied the binding cord with the same unhurried precision she'd used at the start and stepped back. The hall was quiet. Raylor, at the head of the table, was looking at the space in front of him with the expression of a man standing in the aftermath of a building that has just come down. He had not interrupted Lena's reading, had not spoken since his question about the correspondence, had sat for 40 minutes absorbing the full architecture of what had been done inside his own court while he occupied his throne. Soralia had watched him in pieces during the session, careful not to look too long or too directly, the way you were careful around something structural that might not hold. She had watched him receive the Dravath-Petheric correspondence, and had watched the specific moment when he understood, not just intellectually but fully, in the body, in the chest, that the men he had relied on to manage his court had managed it against the woman he had bonded to for reasons that served their territorial interests, and that he had been available for it because he had chosen to stop asking questions that were inconvenient to ask. That moment had lasted about 4 seconds. After it, he had been very still for the rest of the session. Counselor Marin spoke first, into the hall's silence. I want to formally state, for the record of this session, that I was not party to the correspondence that was read. She looked at the table. I was party to the votes. She stopped. Started again. I voted with the majority because the measures were framed procedurally, and I did not look behind the framing. She looked at Soralia directly. That was a failure of judgment. I am stating it for the record. Soralia looked at her. Marin's face was carrying something that took a moment to identify. It was the face of a woman who had been a political operator for 30 years and had just done something that was going to cost her politically, and had done it anyway because the alternative was a specific kind of self-knowledge she wasn't willing to carry. Noted, Soralia said. Petherick cleared his throat from the far corner. The correspondence will be part of the formal record, Soralia said, without looking at him. As will your name. Petherick closed his mouth. Raylor moved. He pushed back from his chair and stood, and every person in the hall tracked him automatically. The instinct that made 48 people's attention follow an alpha king even when he was doing nothing more significant than standing. He looked down the table at Veressa. Is it true? He said. His voice was very quiet. That particular quiet that had weight in it, the kind that rooms felt. Veressa looked at him. She did not look at the documents. She did not look at Soralia. She said, most of it. The hall absorbed that. Soralia absorbed it differently than the rest of the room. Most of it was a confession and a hedge simultaneously. An admission calibrated to establish partial cooperation while preserving the thing that was being held back. She felt the cold drop return, lower this time. Most, Raylor said. The compound, Veressa said. The procurement. The correspondence with the assistant. A pause. Yes. And the rest, he said. Veressa looked at Soralia. It was a specific look, the kind that contained information, the kind that said, this next part is for you. The rest, Veressa said, involves documents that weren't in either of those sets. Documents that Lenny doesn't have because they were never in the palace archive. She held Soralia's gaze. They were in a private correspondence box that I transferred to Lord Gethron of the Western Border Territories 14 months ago for safekeeping. Soralia's breath stayed even. She made it stay even. Lord Gethron, Raylor said. He was looking at Veressa with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Gethron is on the Border Commission. He is, Veressa said. He's also the man who first proposed Soralia's territorial alliance to your father, before she came here, before the bonding. She paused, and the pause was the kind that Veressa used surgically, the kind where the silence did half the work. The correspondence predates your bonding by 2 years. It establishes the original terms of the alliance, the real terms, the ones that weren't in the public contract. The hall was absolutely still. Soralia looked at Veressa and understood that she had been right. There was something else. And the something else was not about Veressa's guilt. It was about Soralia's origins. What terms? Raylor said. Veressa looked at Soralia, not at Raylor. Soralia said before Veressa could, don't. Veressa said, your Luna was not a destined mate, Raylor. She was a negotiated placement. The bond was induced. A compound administered during the Alliance feast, designed to manufacture the mating response between two compatible wolves who had been genetically pre-screened for dominance compatibility. A pause. Your father's council arranged it with Soralia's father 3 years before you ever met her. The silence in the room had a physical quality now, like pressure, like the moment before the storm broke. Raylor's face was doing something she could not watch and could not look away from. She had prepared for the pharmaceutical documents. She had prepared for the council correspondence. She had not prepared for this because she had not known this was something Veressa possessed, had not known Veressa had gone this deep into the archive of her own origins, had not known that the foundation she had built her entire understanding of her own bond on was a document in a box in a border lord's private custody. The worst part was not the room. The worst part was Raylor's face, because she watched him receive it and she watched the sequence move through him. Shock, then calculation, then the specific expression of a man searching for the thing that makes the ground solid again and not finding it. And she understood that she could not account for what he was going to do with this. Had no plan for it. Had never built a plan for it because she had not known there was a this to plan for. Warden Thoss, stationed near the hall entrance, had gone very still. Lena's hands had stopped moving on the document cords. Soralia sat in the Luna's chair with her hands flat on the table and looked at the far wall and did something that took everything she had, which was to not move, not speak, not show any of the 48 territorial witnesses the thing that was happening in her chest. Because in her chest was the specific devastation of a person who has spent 8 years believing one thing about the most fundamental fact of their life and has just learned, in a room full of political witnesses, that they were wrong. And underneath the devastation, quieter, colder, and this was the part that frightened her most because she recognized it as the part that was going to keep her standing, was something that asked, does it change what it became? Not what it started as, what it became. 8 years. Not the feast, not the compound. 8 years of a bond that had been poisoned by the same court that had manufactured it, and a woman who had endured both the manufacture and the poisoning, and a man sitting at the head of a council table who was looking at her with the face of a person who didn't know what he was allowed to feel anymore. Soralia, Raylor said, her name in his mouth with nothing else behind it. She looked at him. Did you know? He said. And that was the question, the one that determined everything. She looked at the man she had bonded to, whether by engineering or destiny or something in between those two things that had no clean name, and she told him the truth. No, she said. I didn't know. He looked at her for a long time, looking for the lie, not finding it. Veressa said from her seat, the documents are authenticated. Lord Gethran will produce them on request. The bonding was arranged. That's a fact now, and it doesn't... Stop talking, Soralia said. Veressa stopped. The room was still. Soralia looked at Veressa, at the woman who had spent 2 years poisoning her body and was now, in the last position available to her, trying to poison the one thing that the poison hadn't reached, the question of whether any of it had been real. She understood, sitting in that chair with the weight of 48 witnesses and the wreckage of a morning's worth of revelations pressing in from every direction, that the next thing she said would determine the shape of everything that followed. That this was the moment Veressa had been saving the document for, not to use earlier when Veressa still had options, but now when the corner had closed in, when the only remaining move was to make the ground unstable enough that nobody could stand on it. The choice Soralia had in front of her was not between two good options. It was between two versions of damage, the damage of answering and the damage of not answering, and she had to select, right now in this room, which damage served the future she was trying to build. She looked at Raylor. She picked up the document she had been holding since the start of the session, the pharmaceutical order, the one with Veressa's signature. She set it at the center of the table. Whatever my bond's origins were, she said, addressing the room, addressing Marin and Petherick and Thoss and Lena and the 48 witnesses and the council seats and 8 years of a life that had been arranged and then undermined and then endured. This document describes what was done to me in this palace, to my body, to my capacity to carry a child, for 2.5 years by a woman currently seated in this hall. She looked at each face in turn, slowly. The origins of my bond don't change that crime. Nothing changes that crime. The hall was silent. Raylor looked at the document at the center of the table. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Veressa. And Soralia watched him make the decision, could see it happen, the particular moment of a man choosing between the version of himself that kept calculating and the version that was done. And she did not breathe. He reached forward and picked up the document. He looked at Varessa's signature for exactly 3 seconds. He said to Warden Thos, without looking away from the document, "Take her into custody." Thos moved. Varessa stood. She stood fast, the chair scraping back, and in her face was finally, the thing that had been underneath the composure for 2 years. Not fear, fury. The cold, stripped fury of a person who had played the longest game in the room and had still lost. "You're making a mistake," she said to Raylor. Her voice was tight. "I've been making mistakes," he said. "I'm stopping." Thos reached her. She did not fight him. She had too much control for that. But she looked past Thos's shoulder at Soralia, and the look she sent across that hall was the kind of look that didn't need words because the meaning was very simple and very clear. This isn't finished. Soralia looked back at her. She knew. She already knew. Because the documents with Lord Gethron were still in Lord Gethron's custody. Because the bonding question had been dropped into the room like a stone into water, and the ripples were not going to stop moving just because Varessa had been taken into custody. Because 48 territorial witnesses had just watched an Alpha King's mate be revealed as a manufactured placement, and those 48 witnesses were going home to 48 territories, and the information was moving whether Soralia controlled it or not. The trap hadn't been the pharmaceutical documents. The trap had been this morning. Varessa had walked into this session knowing exactly what it contained. She had sat for 2 hours absorbing the reading of her own crimes because she had known that the thing she was carrying in reserve was more destabilizing than anything in Lena's document sets. She had waited, perfectly patient, perfectly still, for the moment when Soralia's position was strongest, when the witnesses were most attentive, when the Alpha King's guilt was at its most acute, and then she had detonated the bonding document in the center of it all. Not to save herself. To make sure that even if she went down, she didn't go down alone. Soralia sat in the Luna's chair with her hands flat on the table, and the document at the center, and the sound of Varessa's footsteps leaving the hall under Thos's custody. And she looked at Raylor, and Raylor looked at her, and between them was 8 years of a bond, and the question of what a bond meant when its beginning was something neither of them had chosen. The question had no clean answer, and in the absence of a clean answer, in the specific silence of 48 witnesses who were already calculating how to use what they had just heard, Soralia understood that the ground she had stood on this morning no longer existed. She was going to have to build something new, starting right now, starting in this room, starting with the man at the head of the table who was looking at her like he was waiting to find out if he still had permission to look at her at all. She pushed back her chair and stood. "Clear the hall," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands, pressed flat against the table a moment before, were steady. The rest of her, the part that was not performance, not calculation, not the cold architecture of survival she had built over 3 years, the rest of her was standing in the wreckage of an origin story she had not known she was living inside. And it was doing what she had trained it to do. It was staying upright. For now. The hall emptied in 3 minutes. Not because the witnesses wanted to leave, because Soralia had said clear the hall with the specific gravity of a person who has run out of performances, and the witnesses were experienced enough to understand that the next thing that happened in this room was not for them. Petherick left without looking at her. Marin left last, pausing at the door for half a second in the particular way of a woman who wanted to say something and had decided this was not the moment for it. The territorial delegates filed out in clusters, already talking, already beginning the transmission process that would carry everything they had heard this morning back to 48 territories by nightfall. Lena gathered the document sets and moved to the far corner and stood there, present and quiet, the way she had stood in the archive room for 2.5 years. Thos had taken Varessa out. The hall held Soralia, Raylor, and the specific silence of 2 people who have been in the same room for 2 hours absorbing the same information from different angles and have not yet looked directly at each other without witnesses. Raylor stood from his chair. He didn't speak right away. He walked to the window, the same window where Petherick had stood doing emergency mathematics, and put one hand on the sill and looked out at the courtyard below. His back was to her. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the set of his neck, the controlled stillness of a dominant alpha who was managing something too large to manage cleanly. She waited. Outside, in the courtyard, She could hear the early sounds of the capital processing the morning, carts, voices, the distant noise of the ceremony square where the overnight crowd had finally dispersed. Normal sounds, the sounds of a city that didn't yet know what had happened in this hall. "Tell me," he said, still facing the window, "what you remember about the Alliance feast." She had expected questions, had prepared in the abstract for many kinds of questions. This was not the one she had expected first. "Which part?" she said. "The part where we met." She looked at his back. She thought about the feast, a memory she had handled often enough over 8 years that it had the worn quality of something carried too long, smoothed at the edges. The hall in her father's territory, the delegates, him arriving with 3 council members, and the specific controlled energy of a man who was always performing something even when he thought he wasn't. The moment their eyes had met across the room, and the thing that had happened in her chest that she had spent 8 years interpreting as recognition. "I remember feeling certain," she said, almost immediately. Certain in a way I hadn't felt certain about anything before. She paused. "I thought it was the bond. I thought the bond was supposed to feel like that." He turned from the window. "I felt the same thing," he said. His voice was rough. "That night, the same certainty." He looked at her across the hall. Does knowing the mechanism change what it was? She looked back at him for a long time. She had asked herself that question in the chair with 48 witnesses, while Varessa's footsteps were still audible in the corridor. She had not finished answering it. She was not sure she could finish answering it today, or this week, or in the foreseeable future where all the other things requiring her attention were still in motion. "I don't know yet," she said. "I know what was done to us. I don't know yet what that means about what we became after." He crossed the hall. He crossed it in 8 steps and stopped 3 feet from her, and she held her ground. Not because holding ground was the right strategy, but because moving felt dishonest, and she was finished with every dishonest thing, even the small ones. "Soraya." His voice had dropped to the register that used to undo her. Maybe still did. She was not testing that right now. "What I let happen to you?" "Not right now," she said. "I need to—" "Raylor." She held his gaze. "There are 48 delegates walking out of this palace with the bonding documents in their heads, and Lord Gethrin still holding the authentication files. There are soldiers in the northern section of the ceremony square who haven't reported back to their commanders. And Varessa is in custody, which means the people who were aligned with her are right now making decisions about what that costs them." She looked at him steadily. "What you need to say to me is not the most urgent thing in this palace right now." His jaw worked. "When?" he said. "When the Empire isn't in active fracture," she said. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at the document with Varessa's signature, searching for the shape of something, trying to determine if it was still intact. Then he straightened, and she watched him put the other thing away. Not gone, not resolved, but contained, the way a soldier contained a wound during a fight because the fight was still happening. "Gethran," he said. "He'll move the documents the moment he hears about this morning. He has birds. He may have already heard. I can have the Border Commission hold him. On what grounds? He received documents. That's not a crime." She thought through the geometry of it. "He needs to be offered something, not threatened. Threatened men with leverage use it." Raylor looked at her. "What do we offer?" he said. And the "we" landed differently than it had all morning, not as a performance, as a question with genuine uncertainty in it. A dominant alpha asking his Luna for the strategy because she was the one who had been building it for 14 months. She told him. The first sign that the fracture had reached the military came at the 11th hour. Captain Vrail found Soraya in the war room, a room she had not been permitted to enter for 8 months due to a security reclassification that Dravath had authorized, and that Thos had quietly disagreed with and been overruled on. Thos had unlocked it this morning on his own authority and had not mentioned it to anyone except Soraya. Vrail came in fast and straight-spined with the controlled urgency of a soldier delivering information that required action rather than deliberation. "3rd Regiment," he said, "Western Garrison. They've received a communication from the Thornvale estate. Her house soldiers are mobilizing." Soraya looked up from the map table. "How many?" "House Garrison estimate is 300. They're not moving toward the capital. They're moving toward Gethron's border territory." She processed that in approximately 2 seconds. Veressa in custody, her house soldiers mobilizing not to free her but moving toward the man who held the authentication documents, which meant Veressa had sent the order before this morning's session, had planned for custody, had arranged the document retrieval as a contingency before she ever walked into the council hall. The patience of it was something Soralia would have admired in a different context. "Vrael," she said. "How fast?" They left the estate at first light. Gethron's territory is 8 hours hard ride. She looked at the map, calculated. "They don't need to reach Gethron," she said. "They need to reach the courier relay at Dren's Pass. If they get the documents moving through the relay network..." She stopped. Thought. "We need to reach Gethron first." "We have faster birds," Vrael said. "Birds get intercepted. We need a rider." She looked at him. "You're fastest." "Already standing by." He hadn't waited. She hadn't expected him to. "Seal of the Luna's authority," she said. "Full warrant, requesting the documents transferred to Imperial custody under..." She looked at Raylor. Raylor had entered the war room behind Vrael. He had heard. He moved to the table without preamble and pulled the warrant document toward him and took up the seal stamp. "Under Alpha King's direct order," he said. He stamped it. Set it down. Soralia picked it up. "If Gethron has already transferred the documents," Vrael said, "then we deal with what comes next," she said. "Go." Vrael went. The next 4 hours were the kind of hours that lived in the body rather than the memory, too fast and too physical for the processing that produced narrative. So what remained afterward were fragments, impressions, the specific texture of individual moments rather than a continuous sequence. The Thornvale House soldiers changed course at the 3rd hour. They did not turn back. They split, a portion continuing toward Gethron's territory and the rest swinging north toward the capital, which meant Veressa had given multiple orders before her arrest, and the contingency plan was larger than one document retrieval. Thus activated the capital garrison. 140 Imperial Guard plus the soldiers from the northern section who had, over the course of the morning, moved from passive dissent to a formal declaration of allegiance to the Luna's authority that Captain Vrael had received, verified, and reported to Soralia with the expression of a man who had seen this kind of thing before and knew what it meant. It meant the split was happening now. Not in a week, not as a negotiated political fracture with clean lines and treaty language. Now, in the capital, with house soldiers on the road and garrison forces activating and 48 territorial delegates still inside the palace walls who were going to witness whatever happened next. Raylor commanded from the war room. Soralia had watched him shift into it, the military mind engaging, the political calculation going quiet while something older and more immediate took over. He was good at this, had always been good at this. Whatever she had come to understand about his failures as a partner, his capacity to hold a military situation was not among them. She watched him run it and felt, somewhere underneath everything else that was happening in her chest, a complicated form of grief for the years when his competence had felt like safety. "Northern approach is secured," Thos reported, coming in from the corridor. He was breathing harder than his normal controlled pace. "The Thornvale soldiers coming from the north won't reach the palace gates." "The group heading for Gethron," Raylor said. "Still moving. Our rider is an hour ahead." Thos looked at Soralia. "Gethron may not cooperate with the warrant." "He will," she said. Both men looked at her. "Because Gethron has been on the Border Commission for 16 years, and he knows what happens to Border Commission members who are found holding evidence in a criminal conspiracy against the Empire's Luna." She looked at the map. "He received the documents as a favor. He doesn't want to die for a favor." Raylor's eyes were on her. She felt them without looking. "You've thought about all of this," he said. "Not an accusation, something quieter." "I had 14 months, she said. Ichats. Veressa broke at the 14th hour. Not in the way that people broke when they had no more resources. She still had resources, or believed she did, and that belief was what made her break in the particular way she did. She broke toward, not away. She asked to speak to Soralia. Soralia came to the custody chamber alone. Thos objected. She told him to stay outside. The chamber was a clean room, not a cell, but a room with a lock and no windows and 2 guards outside whose presence was felt without being visible. Veressa was seated. She had been seated for 6 hours, and the stillness that had been controlled in the council hall was a different quality now, the stillness of a body that has been running internal calculations for 6 hours and is running low on certain inputs. Soralia stood. Veressa looked up at her. "The soldiers won't reach Githran in time," Veressa said. "I know," Soralia said. A pause. "Then you know the documents will be in the relay network before—" "Veressa," Soralia looked at her levelly. "My rider left an hour before your soldiers changed course. He carries a warrant under the Alpha King's seal. Gethron will comply." She watched Veressa's face process this. "Your timing was wrong by 1 hour. That's the whole difference." Veressa's jaw tightened. "You can't prove—" "I can prove everything in the document sets," Soralia said. "I have an authenticated witness. I have Marin's formal record statement. I have Raylor's direct order of custody." She looked at Veressa without anger, without triumph, with the specific flat clarity of a person who has been waiting a very long time for this sentence. "You're going to stand before a formal court proceeding. That's what's going to happen." Veressa was quiet for a long moment. Then, "He'll never choose you over stability." She said it quietly, not viciously, as an assessment. "He's an Alpha King. Stability is the only thing he's ever actually chosen." Soralia looked at her. She thought about Raylor in the war room, running the military situation with his hand flat on the map, and his face carrying the expression of a man who had finally run out of choices that let him avoid looking at what he had done. She thought about the warrant with his seal. She thought about what it had cost him, in political terms, to stamp that warrant and set it down. She said, "He chose this morning." Veressa looked at her. "Whatever he chose before," Soralia said, "he chose this morning. That's what I'm working with." She turned and walked to the door. Behind her, Veressa said, "You forgave him." Soralia stopped, her hand on the door. "I haven't decided that yet," she said. She opened the door and walked out. Yeah. The Thornvale House soldiers reached the eastern gate at the 16th hour. Not the palace gate. Thos had secured that before the 11th hour. The eastern gate was the city's main commercial entry, and it was where 60 of the house soldiers had rerouted when the northern approach was blocked, moving into the capital's civilian areas with the specific disorganized momentum of a force that had changed objectives twice in one day, and was now operating on the residual instructions of a commander who was in custody. This was the kind of situation that ended badly if it lasted longer than an hour. Soralia knew this. So did Raylor. So did Thos, who had the expression of a man watching something become more expensive by the minute. "They're not organized enough for an assault," Thos said, "but they're armed in a civilian area and the merchants are starting to—" "I'll go," Soralia said. "Absolutely not," Raylor said. She looked at him. "You are not walking into an armed—" "They're Thornvale House soldiers, not border forces. 60 men who left their estate this morning on orders that have since become pointless because the woman who issued them is in custody." She held his gaze. "They need to be told that, clearly, by someone whose authority they understand." She paused. "They're not going to hear it from you right now." He looked at her. She watched him run the assessment, watched him arrive at the same conclusion she had, which was that she was right. The Thornvale soldiers had spent 8 months watching Veressa occupy a position adjacent to the throne. They had oriented their loyalty accordingly. Sending Raylor into that situation was sending the source of their confusion into a combustible space. Sending the Luna, the woman who had knelt in the ceremony square, who the whole capital had watched with their own eyes, whose authority the soldiers in the northern section had publicly affirmed this morning, was different. "Vrail goes with you," Raylor said. "Vrail and 6, she said. "No more. More looks like a threat." His jaw was tight. "If anything, I know," she said. She turned and walked. The Eastern Gate crowd was not a battle. It was 60 armed men who didn't know what they were doing anymore, standing in a civilian street with their hands on weapons they hadn't decided to use yet, surrounded by merchants and workers who had pressed back to the building's edges and were watching with the particular expression of civilians who have learned that the space between an armed force and indecision was a space you wanted to vacate. Soralia walked in with Vrail and 6 soldiers in imperial colors and stopped 30 feet from the house soldiers' front rank. She didn't announce herself. She didn't need to. The recognition moved through them in a visible wave. She watched it travel from the front rank backward, heads turning, postures shifting, the particular quality of attention that she had earned in the ceremony square last night. She looked at the man who appeared to be commanding, a lieutenant in Thornvale colors, thick-set, around 40, with the face of someone who had been a competent soldier for a long time and was finding this morning beyond his competence. "Your lady is in imperial custody," she said. Her voice carried without effort in the cleared street. "The actions that sent you here are no longer operative. You're standing in a civilian commercial district in the capital, with weapons drawn." She looked at the lieutenant directly. "That's where you are right now." The lieutenant looked at her. He looked at Vriel. He looked at the 6 soldiers. He looked at the street, at the merchants watching from the building edges, at the 200 yards of civilian space between his position and the gate, at the complete absence of any other Thornvale forces. He said slowly, "What happens to us if we stand down?" "You're house soldiers who followed orders," she said. "That's what the record will show, if you stand down now." He looked at her for a long moment. He was doing the specific calculation that soldiers did when the order structure collapsed. And the only remaining question was survival. Not victory, not loyalty, not principle. Just whether the next action preserved the ability to take a next action after that. He sheathed his sword. Behind him, in ragged sequence, 60 swords went back into their sheaths. Soralia breathed. She turned to Vriel. "Escort them to the southern holding area," she said. "Peacefully." She looked at the lieutenant. "Will that be peaceful?" "Yes, my lady," he said. She nodded and stepped back. Vriel moved forward. The crowd that had pressed to the building edges began slowly to move again. Soralia stood in the eastern street with the afternoon light cutting long across the cobblestones and the sounds of the city resuming around her, and her heart doing something in her chest that was not quite steady, but was trying to be. She thought, one thing at a time. That was the whole of it. You stood in the wreckage of every plan you thought you had, and you picked up the nearest thing, and you dealt with it. And then you picked up the next nearest thing, and you kept doing it until the pile was small enough to see over. She walked back toward the palace. Raylor was at the war room entrance when she returned. He had been there. She could tell by his posture that he had been standing in that doorway for a while. She came up the main steps and stopped in front of him, and they looked at each other in the last of the afternoon light. He said, "Gethrin's bird came in 20 minutes ago. He's transferring the documents. Our rider will have them by nightfall." She nodded. "The northern soldiers have formally reported to Vrail's command," he said. 43 of them. They're requesting to be placed under the Luna's direct command structure." She absorbed that, the implications of it, the shape it would give to whatever came next. He said, "The council is requesting an emergency session. Petherick is asking to speak first." "Petherick wants to get ahead of his correspondence file," she said. "Yes." "Let him speak first," she said. Let all of them speak first. The record needs to be complete." He looked at her. He had been looking at her with that expression for most of the day. The expression of a man relearning the dimensions of something he thought he knew the dimensions of. "The Empire is going to ask what we are," he said. "After all of this, the bonding questions, the council correspondence, the custody, they're going to need to understand what the authority structure is." "I know." "What do I tell them?" She looked at him. She looked at the man she had bonded to, manufactured or otherwise, and all 8 years of it, the passion and the drift and the cold stone mornings and the silence that had grown between them like a wall being built one brick at a time, and she thought about what Veressa had said. "He'll never choose you over stability." She thought about his hand on the warrant, about him in the doorway of the war room, about the question, "What do I tell them?" asked with genuine uncertainty, asked as a man rather than a king. She said, "Tell them we're figuring it out." "That's not, it's the truth," she said. "And right now, the truth is the only thing we have left that works." He was quiet. Below the palace, in the capital, the evening bells were beginning. The city was settling into the first night of whatever the Nightgrave Empire was becoming. Somewhere in the south wing, 48 territorial delegates were composing their reports. Somewhere in the custody wing, Veressa was in a clean room calculating the reduced set of options she had left. Somewhere on the eastern road, a rider was carrying a sealed warrant toward Lord Gethrin's border estate and the last authenticated document that had the power to destabilize what was left. Raylor turned and walked back into the war room. At the table, he stopped and looked at the map. The empire spread out in colored territories, the capital at the center, the borders that he had spent 20 years reinforcing and that were right now in 48 separate locations, receiving information that would reshape what they meant. He said without turning, "I'm going to stand before the full court, tomorrow, before the council session." She said nothing. "And I'm going to say what I should have said this morning," he said, "in front of the witnesses, on record." She still said nothing. He turned from the map. "I know it doesn't fix it," he said. "I know there's a version of you that has every reason to—" He stopped. "I'm not asking you to forgive it. I'm asking for the chance to stand in it, publicly, without a wall between me and what it was." She looked at him across the war room, across the map table and the weight of a day that had contained more than most months, and she thought about what it cost a dominant alpha to say that sentence. Not the political cost. She could calculate that easily. The other cost. The kind measured in the currency of pride, of self-image, of the story a man told himself about who he was. She said, "Don't ask me tonight. Ask me in the morning." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. She walked out of the war room. In the corridor, she stopped, put her back against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes for exactly 5 seconds. The specific allowance she had trained herself to for this kind of thing. 5 seconds of the truth before the face went back on. Her hands were shaking slightly. They had been shaking slightly since the Eastern Gate, since the 60 swords went back into their sheaths, since the thing she had been running toward all day finished running and left her standing in a civilian street with nothing left to manage except the interior of herself. She opened her eyes. Down the corridor, Bressa was waiting. 11 years, steady hands, a woman who had been the most reliable constant in Soralia's adult life. She was holding a clean robe and a cup of something warm, and her face was carrying the expression she had when she had information. Soralia walked toward her. "Tell me," she said. "Drevath," Bressa said. "He's requesting formal permission to address the court tomorrow. Not the emergency session, the full ceremonial court." She paused. "He's requesting to speak in support of the Luna's formal authority reinstatement." Soralia stopped. She looked at Bressa. Thought about Drevath at the corner of that corridor this morning, watching her outside Varessa's door, making the calculation that had moved him back the way he came. Thought about 30 years of survival instinct now running in her direction. "He wants to get ahead of the correspondence file," she said. "Yes, my lady." "Let him." Bressa nodded, started to turn. "Bressa," Soralia said. Bressa stopped. "Is there anything else?" Bressa looked at her, the steady, even look of 11 years. "There is one more thing," Bressa said. "The healer, the new one. The one the council doesn't control." She held Soralia's gaze. "She completed the examination you requested 3 weeks ago." Soralia went very still. "The compound is fully cleared from your system," Bressa said. "Has been for approximately 14 months." The corridor was quiet. Soralia stood in it and absorbed what that sentence meant. Not just the medical fact, but the entire shape of it, the 14 months of clear system and the 14 months of everything else running concurrently, the 2 timelines laid over each other. She said, "Thank you." Her voice was even. She walked to her chamber. She did not look back. And in the war room behind her, through 2 corridors and a door, Raylor stood at the map table with his hands spread across the territory lines and his head down. And in the silence of the room, he was doing something that dominant Alpha Kings did not do in front of witnesses. Which was why there were no witnesses. Which was why he had waited until she left. The Empire was still fracturing. The documents were in transit. The court was waiting for morning. And somewhere in the 48 territories now composing their reports, a story was being written about what a Luna's patience could do to an empire. And it was not the story anyone had planned to write when the blood moon rose last night. Tomorrow, Raylor would stand before the full court. Tomorrow, Dreveth would speak. Tomorrow, the formal record would be completed, and the shape of what came next would begin to emerge from the wreckage of what had come before. But tonight, in the specific quiet hours between the end of a war and the beginning of whatever followed it, 2 people occupied separate rooms in a palace that had nearly destroyed them both, and neither of them slept, and neither of them, in the long dark hours before dawn, was entirely alone with the silence. Outside, the capital settled, and in the eastern sky, the blood moon had finally set. What rose in its place was just the ordinary dark, the kind you had to find your way through without any borrowed light. Morning came in gray and cold, not the dramatic light of ceremony, not the blood-red stain of the moon 2 nights ago, just the ordinary gray of a capital city waking up to the first day of something it didn't have a name for yet. Thin cloud cover, the smell of rain that hadn't arrived, the sounds of the market district starting up, because markets started up regardless of what empires did overnight. Soralia had been awake since the 4th hour. She had not slept in any continuous way. She had lain on the bed in her chamber with her eyes open and the ceiling above her doing nothing and her mind doing everything, running and rerunning the sequences of the past 2 days until they lost their sharpness and became something she could hold without cutting herself on. She thought about the healer's report, 14 months of clear system. She let herself think about it fully, without the managed distance she had applied to everything else. Let herself understand what it meant, not just medically, but in the long arc of it, the years of being told her body had failed her when her body had been prevented from succeeding, and the specific loneliness of carrying a grief that turned out to have been manufactured. She did not cry. She had done that somewhere in the 2nd year, alone in this room, when she had still believed the healer's original assessment and had been in the process of accepting it as permanent. She had used that grief then. She did not need to use it again in its revised form. What she felt instead was quieter and harder to name. Something like the sensation of a weight being removed that you had carried so long you had restructured your body around it. Relief and disorientation in the same breath. At the 6th hour, she rose. She dressed without Bressa. She did her own hair. Simply, without the ceremonial pins, just pinned back and clean. She looked at herself in the bronze mirror for a long moment. The woman looking back at her had the face of someone who had been through the specific weather of the last 48 hours and was still standing, and the standing was not elegant, but it was real, and real was the only currency that mattered now. She walked to the council hall. Raylor was already there. He was standing at the head of the table, not seated, with both hands on the surface and his head down in the posture of a man who had spent the night doing the same kind of accounting she had. He looked up when she entered. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had not slept and had decided that sleep was a problem for a later version of himself. He straightened. They looked at each other across the empty hall. He said, "I meant what I said last night." "I know," she said. "I need you to hear it before the court session, before all of it." He paused. "Not as a king, not as—" He stopped himself. "Just as myself." She crossed the hall and stood on the opposite side of the table from him. 6 feet of old wood between them, the same table where Lena had laid out the document sets yesterday morning, the same surface where Varessa's signature had been read aloud to 48 witnesses. He looked at her. "I chose the crown over you," he said. "Not once, 100 times, in 100 small moments, and I called every one of them a necessity, and I believed it because believing it was easier than the alternative." His voice was level, but the level was earned, the way a man's voice was level when it had taken work to get there, and he was doing the work in real time. There was a year, the 3rd year, after the council measures started, where I knew something was wrong and I chose not to look at it directly. I chose ambition and stability and the path of least political resistance. He paused. "I told myself I was managing the empire. I was avoiding my marriage." She listened. She let it come without interrupting it because it needed to be said in full, and she needed to hear it in full, not to satisfy some requirement of justice, but because the truth had a completeness to it that half-truths never achieved, and she was finished with every partial version of everything. "The bond question," he said, "whether it was manufactured. I've been thinking about it since yesterday, and He stopped, looked at his hands on the table. "I don't think it changes what I felt. I think what I felt was real, even if the beginning of it was arranged." He looked up. "But I also know that me believing that doesn't obligate you to believe it, and it doesn't undo anything." Soralia looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it cost a dominant alpha to stand in a room with no witnesses and say those sentences without the armoring of political language. She thought about the version of him she had loved. Not the crown, not the king, the man underneath who was brilliant and careful and capable of this kind of honesty when he had run out of walls to hide it behind. She said, "I believe you felt something real." He looked at her. I also believe you let it get buried under everything else, she said. And I believe you're standing here this morning because you've run out of other options and not entirely because you chose to. And I think you know the difference. His jaw tightened. Then, yes. That's the honest answer, she said. Hold on to that. She picked up the document she had carried in with her. A single page, handwritten, drafted in the 4th hour of the morning when she had finally run out of ceiling to stare at, and set it on the table between them. He looked at it without touching it. What is this? He said. A proposed framework, she said, for the authority structure, what I present to the court this morning. She watched his face. Read it before you agree to it. He reached out and took the page. She watched him read it, watched his expression move through it, the initial assessment, the place where it surprised him, the longer pause near the bottom where he read something twice. He set it down. Equal sovereignty, he said. Yes. The council restructuring has to happen. Drevath can stay if he cooperates with the reform process. The others are negotiable depending on their record. She held his gaze. The Luna's seat becomes a full legislative position, not ceremonial, binding vote on all territorial measures. He looked at the page. The Empire will push back, he said. Parts of it, she said. Other parts watched a Luna kneel in a ceremony square 2 nights ago and understand exactly what the alternative looks like. He was quiet for a moment. You drafted this alone, he said. At 4 in the morning. I've been drafting it for 14 months, she said. Last night I just wrote it down. Something moved through his face. Not the political expression, not the Alpha King face, the other one, the one that had appeared in the corridor at dawn, in the war room, in the council hall when the document was on the table. I'll sign it, he said. She looked at him. Before the court session, he said, not as a concession, as a starting point. He held her gaze. I know the difference between those 2 things. She picked up the page. Then let's go, she said. Bam. The full ceremonial court convened at the 8th hour. Every seat was filled. The 48 territorial delegates who had been in the council hall yesterday had not left, had spent the night in palace guest quarters or the capital's inns waiting, because the instinct of political witnesses was to stay proximate to the events they had witnessed until those events resolved. They sat in the witness gallery with the attentive stillness of people who understood they were present at something that would be in records long after they were not. The council seats held 9 members. Drevath sat in his customary position at the council's head with the expression of a man who had made a decision overnight about which direction survival lay and had dressed accordingly. Formal robes, posture correct, the institutional face of a man who intended to be part of what came next. Warden Thaw stood at the hall entrance with 6 Imperial Guard, all of them carrying the crest of the Empire, and none of them carrying the additional insignia that marked the personal guard of any specific council member. A small distinction. An entirely legible one. Captain Vrail stood along the east wall. Lena stood at the far corner. Bressa, in the second row of the witness gallery, had her hands folded in her lap and her face carrying the specific expression of 11 years of patient waiting that had arrived at its destination. Raylor entered first. The herald announced him, and he walked to the throne and turned to face the court, and then he did not sit down. The hall registered this immediately. An Alpha King who did not sit at the throne during a formal session was an Alpha King who intended to say something before the session began. He stood for a moment in the silence of 400 people who had decided to hold their breath. Then he spoke. He said what he had told Soralia he would say. He said it without notes, without the cadence of prepared political speech, with the plainness of a man who had spent a night arriving at words he was not going to perform. He described the measures, the council authorization chain, his own failure to question what was being done inside his court. He said the word failure without the qualification that political men layered over hard words to soften the consequence. He said, I allowed the erosion of my Luna's authority because it was convenient. I believed a lie about her body because believing it was easier than asking questions whose answers might have complicated my political situation. Every person in this room deserves to hear that stated plainly, in my own voice, without a council record doing it for me. The hall was the most complete silence Soralia had ever heard in a room of 400 people. He said, The empire I am responsible for building requires a different foundation than the one I have been maintaining. That process begins today. He sat down. The silence held for 3 full seconds. Then Soralia entered. The herald announced her as Luna of the Nightgrave Empire, which was the title she had always held, and which the herald had been quietly instructed to use with the full ceremonial weight it was due, rather than the abbreviated form that had crept into official announcements over the last 14 months. She walked to the Luna's position, not the chair 8 feet from the throne, not the witness gallery, not the peripheral position that the ceremony rearrangements had been slowly constructing for her. She walked to the forward dais position that the Luna's authority structure entitled her to, and she stood there and looked at the court. She did not speak immediately. She looked at the witness gallery, at the territorial delegates, at the 9 council members, at Drevath, who met her gaze with the expression of a man making a bet and knowing it. She looked at Raylor. He looked back at her. She said, "The formal record of this session will establish the restructuring of the Nightgrave Authority framework under equal sovereignty. The council reform process begins at the next session. The Luna's legislative seat is active effective today." She looked at the gallery. "Every territory represented in this hall will receive a copy of the framework document bearing both sovereigns' seals by nightfall." She paused. "The proceeding against Lady Veressa Thornvale will be conducted under formal imperial law with full evidentiary record. No summary judgments, every step on record." She held the gallery's attention. "Because the empire I intend to help govern does not conduct justice in private." Drevath cleared his throat. "Councillor Drevath," she said without looking at him, "you'll have your speaking position after the framework is formally entered." A pause. Then, "Yes, my lady." The gallery watched. 400 people in the specific, attentive stillness of witnesses who understood that the shape of the next decade was being sketched in real time in front of them. Lord Petherick, in the front witness row, had his hands on his knees and his eyes on the dais and the expression of a man calculating border implications. He could calculate. The record existed regardless of what he calculated. Soralia set the framework document on the council table, both seals already affixed. "Let's proceed," she said. Time. The session ran 4 hours. Drevath spoke first among the council, as promised. He spoke with the careful precision of a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how much to admit and in exactly what order. He did not grovel. She had not expected him to, and would not have trusted it if he had. He made a formal statement of procedural accountability, named specific votes, named his own reasoning, and sat down with the manner of a man who had just paid a bill he had been carrying a long time. It was not enough. She knew it wasn't enough. He knew she knew. That was a conversation for another session, another day, the longer work of a restructure that would take years rather than hours. Petherick spoke. His statement was more careful than Drevath's. The statement of a man who understood that his correspondence file was in the formal record and was choosing to get ahead of it with language that was cooperative without being confessional. She let him speak. The record had what the record needed. Marin spoke last among the council. She spoke briefly and without political decoration. She said, "I should have asked more questions. That is a failure of judgment that I intend to correct going forward." She paused. "That's all." Soralia thought, "I can work with that." By the 12th hour, the framework had been formally entered into the imperial record. The session closed. The territorial delegates filed out with the packed, purposeful energy of people who had a great deal to communicate to a great many places. The council chamber cleared. Soralia sat at the table for a moment after the others had gone, in the quiet that rooms had after they had held a great deal of human urgency and then released it. She sat and looked at the document set, Lena's 2 sets, the framework, the formal session record, and thought about 14 months of a plan arriving at this particular morning. The plan had not accounted for the bonding documents, had not accounted for the 48-hour acceleration of events, had not accounted for the specific way the blood moon ceremony would become the moment it became, or for Raylor's face in the corridor at dawn, or for the healer's report that Bressa had delivered in a palace hallway while Soralia stood with a cup of warm tea in her hands. Plans never accounted for everything. The gap between what you planned and what actually happened was where you found out who you were. She had found out. Chantse. The formal proceeding against Veressa Thornvale took 3 weeks to complete. It proceeded exactly as Soralia had promised the court, on full evidentiary record, with legal representation, with every document entered and authenticated in open session. The healer's assistant testified. Gethron's documents were entered and authenticated. The pharmaceutical records were confirmed by 3 independent healers. Veressa was found culpable on all charges. The sentencing was exile, not execution. Soralia had been clear on that from the beginning, over the objections of 2 council members who had the instinct of men who preferred irreversible outcomes. She had been clear because she understood the difference between justice and erasure, and because the kind of empire she was helping to build did not conduct its authority through bodies. Veressa left the capital on a gray morning 6 weeks after the blood moon ceremony, under escort to the northern border. She did not look back at the palace as she left. Soralia had not expected her to. Some people carried their losses forward rather than backward. It was not the worst way to carry them. Unquote. The council restructure took longer. Everything real took longer than the ceremony of beginning it. Soralia sat in sessions she had been excluded from for 14 months and found that the work was harder and less dramatic than the fight to be allowed to do it. The specific grinding work of rewriting charter language and renegotiating territorial agreements and finding the words that could hold across 48 different territories with 48 different histories. She was good at it. She had not known she would be, because she had spent 14 months becoming good at survival and had not had the space to discover what she was good at beyond that. She was good at the work, the real work, the work that happened in unglamorous rooms on ordinary mornings. Raylor watched her do it and did not, after the first month, attempt to manage it. He brought his own competencies, the military structure, the border strategy, the alpha authority that certain territories still responded to more readily than anything else. They worked beside each other with the specific dynamic of 2 people who were learning a new syntax for a relationship they had known in a different language. It was not easy. She had not expected it to be easy. Some mornings she sat across a map table from him and felt the 3 years of cold stone in her chest and could not access the warmth that had been there before the cold. Some mornings she could. The ratio shifted over time. He did not rush her. This surprised her more than anything else about the process. She had known him as a man who managed timelines, who controlled sequences, who moved things toward resolution because unresolved things felt like vulnerability. He did not do that with her. He waited. He showed up in the work, day after day, and he waited. Once, in the 7th month, she asked him about it. They were in the war room after a long session, late, tired, the map still spread between them from the border discussion that had run 3 hours. He was rolling the territorial markers, and she was reviewing the amendment draft, and it was the most ordinary version of them that existed, the working version, the version without ceremony or crisis. She said, "You stopped trying to control the timeline." He looked up from the markers. "Between us," she said, "you're not pushing." He held her gaze. "No." "Why?" He set down the marker he was holding. He thought about it. She could see him think about it, the genuine consideration rather than the prepared answer. "Because I spent 8 years treating the bond like it was a thing I was managing," he said, "and I watched what that produced." He looked at the map. "I'm not managing this. I'm waiting to see what it becomes when I stop managing it." She looked at him. She thought about what that cost him, knew what it cost him. 8 years of watching him manage everything had given her a precise understanding of what restraint required from a man like him. She said, "It's becoming something." He looked up. "I don't know what yet," she said, "but something." He held her gaze for a long moment. "That's enough," he said, "for tonight." She looked back at the amendment draft. Something moved in her chest that was not the cold stone and was not the old warmth either. It was a third thing, newer, with the texture of something that had been built rather than found. The kind of thing that took longer to arrive but was harder to unmake. She let it be there. The first winter after the blood moon ceremony was the coldest in 11 years. Soralia stood at the high window of the council chamber on the last morning of that winter, watching the capital below with the early light coming in flat and clean across the snowpack on the rooftops. The capital looked like itself, busy, functional, the 1,000 small activities of people who did not spend much time thinking about what had happened in a ceremony square 6 months ago because they were occupied with the present tense of their lives. That was correct. That was how it was supposed to be. Behind her, she heard the council chamber door. Raylor's footsteps, she knew them without looking, had known them for 8 years. He came to stand beside her at the window. They looked at the capital together. After a while, he said, "The Eastern Territorial report came in, Petherick's trade proposal." "I read it this morning," she said. "The amendment language is better. He's trying." "He is," Raylor said. They were quiet for a moment. Below, the morning market was setting up, carts and voices and the ordinary noise of a city that was, in most of the ways that mattered on a daily basis, functioning. Soralia thought about the woman who had stood in this same palace a year ago, marshaling the evidence of what had been done to her, building in silence because silence was the only tool available. She thought about what that woman had wanted, not this specifically, not the exact shape of this morning, this window, this man beside her with the threads of gray at his temples, and the patience that she was still, some mornings, surprised by. But something like this. Something that had come through the wreckage and was still standing and was, in its unglamorous way, real. The throne was not the source of it. She had understood that partway through the council restructure, sitting in an unremarkable session on a Tuesday afternoon working through charter language, and the understanding had arrived without drama. The throne was the location. The authority was elsewhere. It was in the work and in the decisions and in the particular morning after morning quality of people who chose to keep choosing. She had told the full court, on a day she could barely remember now through the accumulated weight of everything that had followed, the empire deserves to witness the kind of king who allowed such cruelty. They had witnessed it, and then they had witnessed what came after. The slower, less dramatic thing, the rebuilding that didn't have a ceremony and didn't produce an image that anyone would call cinematic. That was the work. That was the actual shape of it. She said, still looking at the window, "The healer's second appointment is tomorrow." Raylor was very still beside her. She hadn't told him yet. Had been carrying it in the quiet for 3 weeks since she'd made the appointment, waiting for the right moment, not entirely sure what the right moment looked like. "The system has been clear for over a year," she said. "She thinks—" She stopped, steadied. "She thinks there's no medical reason to believe a pregnancy isn't possible." The silence beside her had a different quality than any of the silences they had occupied together in the last 6 months. Denser. More careful. She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression that she had no archive for. Not the king's face, and not the managed face, and not the stripped-down face she had seen in corridors and council halls. Something newer than all of those. His jaw worked. He said, "Soralia." Just her name. The same way he had said it in the ceremony square when she was kneeling on the stone, but different in every way that mattered. Not desperation, not authority, not the sound of a man trying to manage a situation. Just her name, said by a person who meant it. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, letting herself look, which was something she had been cautious with for months and was being less cautious with now. She looked at the man she had bonded to, manufactured or otherwise, the question still without a clean answer and increasingly without the urgency it had once carried. And she found, in the looking, that the cold stone in her chest was smaller than it had been. Not gone. She did not think it would ever be entirely gone. Some things that lived in the body took up permanent residence and became part of the architecture rather than visitors, but smaller. And beside it, sharing the same space, the newer thing, the built thing. She said, "I know we're not—" She stopped, started again. "I know there's still work." "There's always work," he said. His voice was rough. "Between us," she said. "Between us," he agreed. "There's still work." He held her gaze. "I'm not afraid of the work." She looked at him. She thought, this is what redemption actually looks like. Not the ceremony of it, not the dramatic public statement. Those were real, those mattered, those were part of the record, and the record mattered. But redemption in the body was this ordinary morning at a window. This man who had learned, later than he should have, but genuinely, that the choice to stop managing was also a choice. Made every morning, made again. She turned back to the window. After a moment, his hand moved, slow, without pressure, without demand. He set his hand beside hers on the windowsill, not over it, beside it. She looked at their hands for a moment. Then she turned hers over. They stood at the window together, the capital below them going about the ordinary business of a winter morning, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing that needed to be said that the gesture hadn't already held. Outside, the first real light of spring was beginning to break through the cloud cover, pale and clean, the kind of light that didn't promise warmth but suggested it, the kind that required patience, the kind that, if you waited long enough, delivered. The Empire was not the same as it had been before the Blood Moon ceremony. It was not finished becoming what it was going to be. Neither were they. That was not a failure. That was the shape of real things. Real things were never finished while there were people inside them who were still choosing, still working, still turning toward each other on ordinary mornings at cold windows and deciding, without drama, without ceremony, without the borrowed light of any moon, to stay. Somewhere in the Empire, in the records of 48 territories, a document was filed that described the restructure of the Nightgrave Authority framework. It named 2 sovereigns. It used both names. Equal weight, equal placement, the same size seal. It was not a romantic document, it was a legal one. But legal documents, written with enough care, could hold the things that needed holding. And in the palace above the capital, in the slow light of the first morning of spring, 2 people stood at a window and held them,